August 6, 1945, the United States dropped an atomic bomb on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. Then, 3 days later, on August 9th, a second bomb fell on Nagasaki. Within a week, Japan surrendered, ending the bloodiest war in human history. For 80 years, the same question has persisted. Why did America use this devastating weapon not once, but twice? The answer most commonly offered is simple. The bombs ended the war and saved lives. American leaders believed that invading Japan would cost hundreds of thousands of American casualties, and that the atomic bombs avoided this terrible price. For decades, this explanation has satisfied most Americans. However, while not entirely wrong, it leaves out much of the story. The decision to drop 2 atomic bombs on Japan did not come from a single meeting or a single man. It grew out of a brutal 4-year war, a divided Japanese government, a new American president who had been in office for less than 4 months, and a weapon so new that no one fully understood what it would do. The decision also involved competing priorities within governments on both sides of the Pacific, each struggling with internal disagreements about how the war should end. The outcome was not certain. Other paths existed. Some American leaders believed Japan might surrender without atomic bombs. Others thought one bomb would be enough. Inside Japan, some officials wanted peace, while others demanded a final battle to the death. At the same time, the Soviet Union was about to enter the war against Japan, adding yet another layer of pressure to an already complex situation. To understand why 2 atomic bombs fell on Japan, we must first understand both the nature of the war that preceded them and the leader who inherited responsibility for ending it. Section 1. The New President. The Pacific War had become what historian John Dower, in War Without Mercy, called a conflict without mercy. Both sides fought with fierce hatred and brutality. This was not like the fighting in Europe, where surrendering soldiers could usually expect to be treated as prisoners. In the Pacific, surrender was rare, and mercy was scarce. American views of Japan had been shaped by terrible events. In April 1942, after American and Filipino forces surrendered on the Bataan Peninsula, Japanese troops forced tens of thousands of prisoners to march for days without adequate food or water. Thousands lost their lives from starvation, illness, and outright violence along the way. News of the Bataan Death March reached the American public and created lasting anger. That same year, following the Doolittle raid on Tokyo, no mercy was shown to the captured American airmen. Their fate was filmed and shown to cheering crowds. Footage of this atrocity eventually made its way to America, further hardening attitudes. Throughout the Pacific, the fighting showed a disturbing pattern. Japanese forces rarely surrendered, having been trained to believe that surrender was the ultimate disgrace. As a result, on island after island, Japanese soldiers fought to the bitter end. The situation was disturbing when civilians were involved. On the island of Saipan in 1944, Japanese propaganda told civilians that American soldiers would commit atrocities against them. When American forces arrived, hundreds of Japanese families threw themselves off cliffs rather than be captured. Mothers jumped while holding their children. These scenes deeply troubled American observers and raised dark questions about what an invasion of Japan itself might bring. At Iwo Jima in February 1945, the American military faced roughly 21,000 Japanese defenders. Of these, only about 200 survived to become prisoners. The rest either fell in battle or took their own lives rather than surrender. American casualties were also heavy, with more than 6,800 Americans losing their lives and about 20,000 wounded. By early 1945, American aircraft were already destroying Japanese cities using conventional weapons, not atomic bombs. On the night of March 9th to 10th, 1945, more than 300 American B-29 bombers dropped incendiary bombs on Tokyo. These devices contained a jelly-like substance that burned intensely and stuck to whatever it touched. The incendiaries started fires that spread quickly through Tokyo's wooden buildings. These fires joined together into a massive firestorm. The heat was so intense that even the water in the canals boiled. Historian Richard Frank in Downfall describes the horror of that night. Survivors recalled people bursting into flames in the streets. The Sumida River, which many people fled toward, hoping to escape the fire, became a scene of unspeakable devastation. Somewhere between 80,000 and 100,000 civilians lost their lives in that single night of bombing. This toll exceeded the immediate casualties at Hiroshima. The firebombing campaign continued through the spring of 1945. Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, and dozens of other Japanese cities were hit in turn. By summer, large portions of Japan's urban areas had been destroyed by conventional bombs. Yet despite this enormous destruction, Japan's leaders continued the war. What American planners saw next would convince them that invading Japan might cost more lives than any battle in history. The Battle of Okinawa, which ended in June 1945, brought the war to Japan's doorstep. Okinawa was Japanese territory, not a distant Pacific island. Japanese forces used kamikaze strikes on a massive scale, with pilots intentionally crashing their planes into American ships. The fighting lasted nearly 3 months. Both military and civilian casualties were enormous. American planners looked at Okinawa and saw a preview of what awaited them on the main Japanese islands. These developments created intense pressure in Washington to find methods that could break Tokyo's resolve. Into this desperate situation stepped a new president who had never been prepared for the job. Harry Truman became president on April 12, 1945, after Franklin Roosevelt suddenly passed away from a stroke. Truman had served as vice president for only 82 days. Roosevelt had rarely met with him and had told him almost nothing about the most secret military programs. Truman later said he felt as if the moon, the stars, and all the planets had fallen on him. On April 25, 1945, just 2 weeks after becoming president, Truman received his first full briefing on the Manhattan Project. Secretary of War Henry Stimson, a respected elder statesman, came to the White House with General Leslie Groves, who ran the atomic program. Stimson called the bomb the most fearsome weapon ever known in human history. Truman learned that scientists had been working since 1942 on atomic weapons using nuclear reactions. The project had employed tens of thousands of workers across multiple secret facilities, most of whom had no idea what they were building. The cost had been high, which was more than $2 billion. 2 different weapon designs were being developed, one using uranium and one using plutonium. The uranium weapon was expected to work without testing, but the plutonium design would need a test before anyone would know if it worked. Truman had little experience in foreign policy and therefore relied heavily on the advisors he inherited from Roosevelt. These men had already been planning how to use the bomb, not whether to use it. In their minds, the weapon had been built to be used. The question was how and where, not if. Stimson formed a special group called the Interim Committee to advise on atomic policy. In late May 1945, this committee met to discuss how the new weapon should be deployed. The members included government officials, scientists, and military leaders. Historian J. Samuel Walker, in Prompt and Utter Destruction, argues that the committee's recommendation reflected a deeper assumption that maximum psychological impact achieved through combining military and civilian targets would be necessary to break Japan's will to fight. The committee recommended using the weapon without advance warning against a target that combined military importance with a civilian population. The goal was to create maximum impact so that Japan's leaders would understand what they faced. Some scientists who had worked on the bomb disagreed with this approach. In June 1945, a group of scientists in Chicago, led by physicist James Franck, submitted what became known as the Franck Report. They argued that the United States should demonstrate the weapon on an uninhabited area first, giving Japan a chance to surrender before any city was destroyed. They warned that using the bomb on civilians without warning would damage America's moral standing and might start a dangerous arms race in the post-war world. Their recommendation, however, was not adopted. Military leaders worried that a demonstration might fail, making the country look weak. They also worried Japan might move prisoners of war to a warned target, and noted that only a few devices were available. If a demonstration did not convince Japan to surrender, precious weapons would have been wasted. The plan remained to use the bombs on cities as soon as they were ready. Yet the atomic option was only one of several paths being considered in Washington. And understanding American choices requires examining what was happening simultaneously inside Japan. Section 2. Two governments, no solution. By mid-1945, American planners were weighing multiple strategies to force Japan's surrender. At the same time, inside Tokyo, Japan's government had split into competing factions that outside pressure alone could not seem to break. Understanding this impasse is essential to understanding why two bombs fell. American military leaders had developed Operation Downfall, a two-stage plan to invade Japan. The first stage, called Operation Olympic, would send hundreds of thousands of American troops to the southern Japanese island of Kyushu on November 1, 1945. The second stage, Operation Coronet, would attack the Tokyo area in March 1946. Everyone expected these invasions to be extremely costly. On June 18, 1945, President Truman met with his top military advisors to discuss the invasion. The casualty estimates presented at this meeting were serious but varied widely depending on assumptions. Walker notes in his book that the numbers discussed at this meeting were significant but lower than figures cited after the war. Later claims that the atomic bombs saved 1 million American lives do not match the planning documents from 1945, though the invasion was still expected to be very costly. Invasion, however, was not the only option American leaders considered. Several alternative strategies were under active discussion. These included continuing the naval blockade that was already crippling Japan's economy, maintaining the conventional bombing campaign that had devastated so many cities, waiting for the Soviet Union to join the fight against Japan, changing the surrender terms to allow Japan to keep its emperor, and demonstrating the atomic bomb on an empty target to show its power without leveling a city. Each option had problems. The blockade might take many months or even years to force Japan to yield, during which fighting would continue across Asia and thousands more would die. Changing the terms was politically risky because Roosevelt had announced a policy of unconditional surrender at the Casablanca Conference in 1943. Backing away from this demand might look like weakness to the American public, which had suffered through 4 years of war. A demonstration shot might fail or simply not convince Japanese leaders to surrender. American intelligence was reading Japanese communications through a secret program called MAGIC. These intercepted messages showed that some Japanese leaders were exploring peace through Soviet diplomatic channels. But the messages also showed that Japan was not ready to accept unconditional surrender. Japanese leaders wanted to negotiate better terms, not give up completely. They were especially concerned about what would happen to their emperor. At the same time, MAGIC also revealed something deeply troubling. Japan was moving large numbers of troops to Kyushu. Richard Frank documents how American intelligence tracked this massive buildup throughout the summer of 1945. By late July, the number of Japanese defenders on Kyushu had grown far beyond early estimates. Japanese forces were digging fortifications, moving artillery into caves, and preparing suicide boats and planes to attack invasion ships. American planners worried that their invasion casualties would be much higher than first predicted. Historian Robert Maddox, in Weapons for Victory, notes that by late July, intelligence estimates suggested Japanese forces on Kyushu might reach 600,000 or more by the planned invasion date. Some American military planners began to question whether the invasion was still the best approach. The atomic option became more attractive as an alternative. Inside Japan, a group called the Supreme War Council held real power over war policy. This group, sometimes called the Big Six, included 6 of Japan's most powerful leaders, the Prime, Foreign, War, and Navy ministers, along with the chiefs of the Army and Navy general staffs. Yet these 6 men had split into 2 opposing factions, and because neither side could overcome the other, the government remained paralyzed at the very moment when quick decisions were most needed. War Minister General Korichika Anami led the faction that wanted to continue fighting. Anami believed Japan should prepare for a final homeland battle, which the military called Ketsugo. The idea was to make an American invasion so costly that Washington would eventually agree to negotiate rather than continue losing soldiers. Anami and other military leaders believed that if Japan could inflict enough casualties in the first weeks of fighting, the American public might demand peace talks. They hoped to save the emperor and avoid complete occupation. Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo led those who wanted to find a way to end the war. Yet even the peace faction was not willing to accept unconditional surrender. They sought to preserve what they called the kokutai, a term that meant Japan's essential national character. Above all, this meant keeping the emperor on his throne. Without assurance about the emperor, even the peace faction could not bring itself to surrender. Japan had placed special hope in one country, the Soviet Union. The 2 nations had signed a neutrality agreement at the start of the Pacific War, and as the conflict turned against Tokyo, some leaders believed Moscow might help broker peace with the Western allies on terms better than unconditional surrender. In June 1945, Emperor Hirohito approved sending peace feelers to the Soviets. Japanese diplomats approached Moscow, hoping Stalin would agree to mediate. What Japanese leaders did not know was that Stalin had already secretly promised to join the fight against Japan. Earlier, at the Yalta Conference in February 1945, Stalin had agreed to attack Japan within 3 months of Germany's surrender. In exchange, the Soviet Union would gain territory in Asia that Russia had lost to Japan in 1905. As it happened, Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, which meant Soviet entry was scheduled for around August 8. Moscow was not going to help Japan make peace. It was planning to invade. Historian Tsuyoshi Hasegawa in Racing the Enemy describes the Japanese diplomats desperately seeking Soviet help in the summer of 1945. They offered territorial concessions and promised neutrality in future conflicts. Though the Soviet leaders listened politely, they gave no real encouragement, as Stalin was simply waiting until his forces were ready to invade Manchuria. Emperor Hirohito occupied a strange and difficult position in this crisis. By tradition, the emperor stood above politics. He was supposed to approve decisions made by his government, not make decisions himself. Yet Hirohito was increasingly worried about the war's direction. He could see that Japan was losing. His interventions would eventually prove decisive in ending the war. But in the summer of 1945, he moved carefully, reluctant to break with tradition. While Tokyo remained paralyzed by indecision, scientists in New Mexico were preparing to test a weapon that might change everything. Section 3. The weapon and its targets. To understand what followed, it helps to know that the atomic bombs dropped on Japan represented 2 completely different weapons designs. Understanding this technical detail helps explain why 2 bombs were used in such rapid succession. The Manhattan Project had developed 2 types of atomic bombs along parallel tracks. The first, nicknamed Little Boy, used uranium-235 and a relatively simple design called a gun-type mechanism. Inside the bomb, 1 piece of uranium would be fired into another piece like a bullet from a gun. When the 2 pieces came together, they formed enough mass to trigger a nuclear chain reaction and an explosion. Scientists were confident this design would work because the physics was well understood, and they saw no need to test it before using it in combat. As a result, Little Boy would be the first atomic bomb dropped, even though it had never been tested. The second bomb, nicknamed Fat Man, used plutonium-239 and a much more complex design called implosion. Conventional explosives arranged around a plutonium core would all detonate at the same instant, compressing the core until a nuclear reaction began. The timing had to be perfect. If the explosives did not fire together precisely, the bomb would fail. The implosion design was less certain, and scientists insisted on testing it before anyone would know if it worked. On July 16, 1945, in the desert of New Mexico near a place called Trinity Site, scientists tested the plutonium design. The countdown reached 0 just before dawn, and for a fraction of a second, nothing happened. Then came a blinding flash of light that could be seen for hundreds of miles, followed by a massive fireball rising into the air. A blast wave flattened the steel tower that had held the bomb. A mushroom-shaped cloud climbed toward the sky. The Trinity test worked, producing an explosion equivalent to about 20,000 tons of TNT, which was more powerful than scientists had predicted. Some were terrified by what they had created. J. Robert Oppenheimer, the scientific director of the project, later compared the moment to a passage from Hindu scripture about divine destruction. General Leslie Groves, who ran the Manhattan Project, had pushed hard to develop both bomb types at the same time. That effort had cost enormous amounts of money and required building entire secret cities to produce the nuclear material. But it meant that by late July 1945, the United States had 2 working atomic bombs ready to use, with more plutonium bombs being manufactured on a continuing basis. The idea of using multiple bombs had been part of the plan from the beginning. A 1944 agreement between President Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, discovered in Maddox's research for weapons for victory, stated that once the bomb was ready, it might be used against the Japanese, who should be warned that this new weapon would be repeated until their surrender. Multiple atomic strikes were expected, not a single warning shot. Choosing which Japanese cities to target involved careful calculation. A target committee met in the spring of 1945 to identify suitable cities. The committee looked for places with military or industrial importance that had not already been heavily damaged by conventional firebombing. They wanted targets where the bomb's effects could be clearly measured and cities large enough to demonstrate the weapon's full destructive power. Kyoto, Japan's ancient capital and a center of culture, religion, and history, was originally on the target list. Secretary of War Stimson personally insisted it be removed. Stimson had visited Kyoto before the war and understood its importance as a cultural treasure. He worried that destroying Kyoto would create such lasting hatred that post-war cooperation with Japan would become impossible. His intervention saved the city. The final target list included Hiroshima, Kokura, Niigata, and Nagasaki. Hiroshima was placed at the top partly because intelligence suggested it did not hold American prisoners of war, though this belief proved tragically incorrect. The targets were specifically preserved from conventional bombing so the effects of the atomic weapons could be clearly observed. The question of whether to warn Japan or conduct a demonstration was considered and rejected. American leaders worried that a demonstration might fail, humiliating the country and emboldening Japan. They worried that if Japan knew a target in advance, they might move prisoners of war there. They also noted that only a few bombs were available. If a demonstration did not convince Japan to surrender, the weapons would have been wasted and an invasion would still be necessary. On July 25, 1945, while the Potsdam Conference was underway, American military commanders issued the order to use atomic bombs against Japan. The order directed that bombs should be used as soon as made ready and did not require separate approval for each attack. Once the first bomb was dropped, the second would follow as soon as it was ready and the weather was suitable. In other words, the plan for continued atomic attacks was already in place before Hiroshima. These preparations converged at Potsdam, where Allied leaders gathered to shape both the end of the war and the beginning of the post-war world. Section 4. Potsdam and the Final Countdown. At Potsdam, near the ruins of Berlin, the leaders of the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union met to settle arrangements for post-war Europe. But beneath the surface of official business, each power was also maneuvering to shape how the Pacific War would end and what would come after. The Potsdam Conference ran from July 17th to August 2nd, 1945. President Truman met with Soviet leader Joseph Stalin and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. Partway through the conference, Churchill was replaced by Clement Attlee after the Labour Party won the British election. The official agenda focused on Germany and Europe, but Japan was never far from anyone's mind. On July 16th, the same day the conference opened, the Trinity test succeeded in New Mexico. Detailed reports of the explosion reached Truman at Potsdam over the next few days. According to several observers, Truman's confidence seemed to grow noticeably after receiving the news. He was no longer just a new president facing experienced leaders. He now controlled a weapon unlike anything the world had seen. Truman decided to tell Stalin about the bomb, but only in the vaguest terms. During a break in the conference proceedings, Truman walked over to Stalin and casually mentioned that the United States had developed a new weapon of unusual destructive force. But Stalin showed almost no reaction, simply saying he hoped America would make good use of it against the Japanese. Truman and his advisors thought Stalin had not understood the significance of what he had been told. In fact, Stalin understood very well. What Truman did not know was that Soviet spies had been feeding information about the Manhattan Project to Moscow for years. Klaus Fuchs, a physicist who had worked at Los Alamos, was among those who passed secrets to Soviet intelligence. Stalin was not surprised by Truman's revelation because he already knew about the bomb. He simply did not show his hand. At Yalta 5 months earlier, Stalin had promised to enter the war against Japan within 3 months of Germany's defeat. That deadline would fall in mid-August, and Soviet forces were already massing along the border of Japanese-held Manchuria. Hasegawa argues in Racing the Enemy that some American leaders wanted to end the war before the Soviets could enter it in force. Soviet participation would give Stalin claims to territory and influence in East Asia. Using the atomic bomb quickly might force Japan to surrender to America alone, limiting Soviet gains. Others argue that ending the war quickly to save American lives was the primary concern. Both motivations may have operated at the same time. On July 26, 1945, the Allies issued the Potsdam Declaration, demanding Japan's unconditional surrender. The declaration warned of prompt and utter destruction if Japan did not give up. It outlined terms for surrender but did not mention the atomic bomb specifically. The language about what would happen to the emperor was intentionally vague. Some American officials had wanted to offer clearer assurances that Japan could keep its imperial system, believing this might encourage faster surrender, but this approach was not adopted. Japan's public response to the Potsdam Declaration used the Japanese word mokusatsu. This word has been translated in different ways, as ignore, as withhold comment, or as treat with silent contempt. American leaders interpreted it as a flat rejection of the surrender terms. The Japanese government may have meant only that they were still considering the terms and could not respond yet. But the message received in Washington was that Japan had said no. With diplomatic approaches seemingly exhausted, the final sequence of events moved with terrible speed. On the island of Tinian in the Pacific, Little Boy was fully assembled and ready. Weather forecasters were watching for clear skies over Japan. The countdown to Hiroshima had begun. What followed would be 3 of the most consequential days in human history. Section 5. Hiroshima, Soviet entry, and Nagasaki. At 8:15 a.m. on August 6, 1945, a B-29 aircraft named Enola Gay dropped the uranium bomb, named Little Boy, over Hiroshima. The weapon detonated about 1,900 feet above the city with a blinding flash. In an instant, the center of Hiroshima was engulfed in an intense fireball. A blast wave and searing heat radiation spread outward, flattening buildings and igniting a firestorm. Tens of thousands of people lost their lives immediately, and the blast and fires destroyed roughly 70% of Hiroshima's buildings. An estimated 80,000 people were killed within hours, and many tens of thousands more were grievously injured. Countless others would later suffer from burns and radiation sickness, leaving the city a smoldering ruin. By the end of 1945, approximately 140,000 people had died as a result of the Hiroshima bombing. In Washington, President Truman announced the attack and issued a warning to Japan. Truman told the American people that the bomb represented a harnessing of the basic power of the universe. He warned Japan to expect a rain of ruin from the air if they did not surrender. The statement made clear that more attacks would follow unless Japan gave up. In Tokyo, confusion and uncertainty reigned. Communications with Hiroshima had been cut off almost completely. Initial reports were unclear about what had happened. Some officials thought it might have been a massive conventional bomb. It took time for Japanese leaders to understand that a single bomb had destroyed an entire city in an instant. Nothing like this had ever happened before in human history. On August 7th, Emperor Hirohito told his advisor, Marquis Kido Koichi, that the war must end quickly. The emperor could see that Japan faced a new kind of danger, but the Supreme War Council remained divided. The Big Six could not reach an agreement on how to respond. Military leaders presented arguments for waiting. Maybe Hiroshima was an isolated event. It was possible that America had only one such bomb. Japan could wait to see what happened next before making any decision. War Minister Anami argued that it was too soon to give up hope of achieving better surrender terms through continued resistance. Then, on August 8th, a second blow struck Japan from an unexpected direction. The Soviet Union declared war on Japan and launched Operation August Storm, a massive invasion of Manchuria. Approximately 1.5 million Soviet troops attacked Japanese positions across a front stretching thousands of miles. Soviet tanks, aircraft, and infantry overwhelmed Japanese defenses. The speed and power of the assault overwhelmed Japanese commanders who had expected more warning before any Soviet attack. Hasegawa emphasizes in Racing the Enemy how devastating the Soviet entry was for Japan's diplomatic strategy. Leaders in Tokyo, who had hoped Moscow might help negotiate peace terms, suddenly faced a new and powerful enemy. The Kwantung Army in Manchuria, once Japan's most powerful military force, was collapsing in the face of the Red Army offensive. Any hope of mediation through Moscow had vanished. Japan now faced a two-front war that it could not possibly win. American atomic bombs could destroy cities from the air, while Soviet tanks were rolling through Manchuria on the ground, overwhelming Japanese forces that had been stationed there for years within a matter of days. The military situation had become completely impossible. Yet even now, with enemies closing in from both directions, the Supreme War Council could not agree on what to do. The deadlock that had paralyzed Japanese decision-making for months continued even in the face of this crisis. On the morning of August 9th, while Japanese leaders were still trying to respond to these twin disasters, a third blow fell from the sky. The B-29 Boxcar carried Fat Man, the plutonium implosion bomb, toward Japan. The original target was the city of Kokura, but smoke and cloud cover made the aiming point invisible. After 3 unsuccessful passes over Kokura, with fuel running dangerously low, the crew made the decision to divert to their secondary target, the port city of Nagasaki. At 11:02 local time, Fat Man exploded over Nagasaki. The city's hilly terrain limited the blast effects somewhat compared to flat Hiroshima, but the destruction was still enormous, leveling a large portion of the city and killing tens of thousands immediately. By the end of 1945, approximately 70,000 people had died as a result of the Nagasaki bombing. The 3-day gap between Hiroshima and Nagasaki was determined mainly by practical factors: how quickly the second bomb could be assembled and transported, weather conditions over Japan, and the standing order to use bombs as soon as they were ready. There was no separate high-level decision to drop the second bomb. The order issued on July 25th had already authorized continued attacks until Japan surrendered or the United States ran out of bombs. Historians continue to debate which factor mattered most in forcing Japan's surrender: the atomic bombs, Soviet entry, or the combination of both. Frank argues in Downfall that both were essential. The bombs showed that Japanese cities could be destroyed one by one without warning. Soviet entry eliminated the last hope of negotiated peace through Moscow and opened a second front that Japan could not defend. Together, they created pressure that finally broke the stalemate in Tokyo. With both atomic destruction and Soviet invasion now undeniable realities, Japan's leadership faced a crisis that demanded an extraordinary response. Section 6. The Emperor's Intervention and Surrender. In the days following Nagasaki, Japan's internal paralysis finally broke, but this happened only through direct intervention by the emperor, who by tradition was supposed to stay above political decisions rather than make them himself. On August 9th, the same day Nagasaki burned, the Supreme War Council met in emergency session. The Big Six remained split down the middle. 3 members, led by Foreign Minister Togo, wanted to accept the Potsdam Declaration with one condition, that Japan could keep its emperor. 3 others, led by War Minister Anami, demanded additional conditions. They wanted Japan to handle its own disarmament, conduct its own war crimes trials, and avoid foreign military occupation. The government was paralyzed at the moment of Japan's greatest crisis. Historian Robert Butow, in Japan's Decision to Surrender, argues that this paralysis revealed a central weakness in Japan's political system: the inability to make decisive choices when military and civilian leaders disagreed. This systemic flaw pushed Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki to take an unprecedented step. In the early hours of August 10th, with the council still unable to agree, Suzuki asked Emperor Hirohito to break the tie by stating his personal preference. This violated the long tradition that the emperor should only approve decisions that his government had already made. When asked for his view, Hirohito said that continuing the war would lead only to the destruction of the Japanese nation and the prolonging of bloodshed and cruelty throughout the world. The time had come, he declared, when Japan must bear the unbearable. He supported accepting the Potsdam Declaration, provided that Japan could preserve the imperial institution. Japan sent a message to the Allies on August 10th, offering to accept the Potsdam terms with the understanding that the emperor's position would not be threatened. In Washington, officials debated how to respond. Some wanted to insist on unconditional surrender with no guarantees about the emperor. Others argued that accepting Japan's condition would end the war faster and save lives on all sides. The American response, sent on August 11th, was carefully worded. It said that the emperor would be subject to the supreme commander of Allied forces, but did not explicitly abolish the imperial system. The message was intentionally ambiguous, leaving room for interpretation. Even after the emperor's intervention, some military officers refused to accept that Japan would surrender. On the night of August 14th to 15th, a group of young army officers attempted a coup. They believed that surrender was unacceptable and that Japan should continue fighting even unto national destruction. The plotters tried to seize the imperial palace and destroy a recording of the emperor's surrender announcement before it could be broadcast. However, palace guards and officers loyal to the emperor stopped the attempted coup, and the recording survived. On August 15, 1945, the Japanese people heard their emperor's voice for the first time in history. Radio stations across Japan broadcast Hirohito's recorded announcement at noon. Citizens gathered around radios in homes, offices, and public squares to listen. The emperor spoke in formal court language that many ordinary people could barely understand, using phrases and vocabulary that differed greatly from everyday Japanese. But the meaning was unmistakable that Japan was surrendering. The emperor spoke of having accepted the provisions of the Joint Declaration, meaning the Potsdam terms. He acknowledged that continuing the war would lead only to the destruction of the Japanese nation. He spoke of a new and most cruel bomb and the need to endure the unendurable and suffer what is insufferable. He asked his people to accept defeat so that Japan as a nation might survive and eventually rebuild itself for future generations. The formal surrender ceremony took place aboard the American battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay on September 2, 1945. The enormous ship was anchored where it could be seen from the Japanese shore. Japanese officials, including Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu and General Yoshijiro Umezu, came aboard to sign the surrender documents, while General Douglas MacArthur and representatives of all the Allied powers watched in formal silence. Hundreds of American aircraft flew overhead during the ceremony. World War II, the deadliest conflict in human history, was finally over. Yet the question has persisted since. Why had it taken 2 atomic bombs to reach this point? Section 7. Why 2 bombs? The question of why America dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan within 3 days has no single answer. Multiple factors combined to create this outcome, and historians continue to debate their relative importance. First and most directly, the operational order issued on July 25th authorized the use of atomic bombs as they became available. This order did not require separate approval for each attack. Once given, it set in motion a military process that would continue until Japan surrendered or the United States ran out of bombs. From the perspective of commanders in the field, Nagasaki was simply the next step in an ongoing operation. Second, American planners expected that Japanese leaders would not surrender after a single attack, no matter how devastating. The course of the Pacific War suggested that Japan would fight on regardless of losses. Japanese forces had died almost to the last man defending distant islands. Why would one bomb, no matter how powerful, change Japan's behavior? American leaders assumed that sustained pressure would be needed to break Japanese resistance. Third, the existence of 2 different bomb designs created both the capability and the institutional momentum to use both weapons. The Manhattan Project had invested enormous resources in developing the uranium bomb and the plutonium bomb along separate tracks. Using only one type would have left the other untested in actual combat conditions. Military leaders wanted to observe how both performed against real targets. Meanwhile, plutonium bombs were continuing to roll off the production line. From the military's perspective, atomic bombing was becoming a continuing campaign, not a one-time demonstration. Fourth, the timing was shaped by the race with Soviet entry into the Pacific War. Historian Gar Alperovitz argues in his book, The Decision to Use the Atomic Bomb, that some American leaders wanted to end the war before Red Army forces could claim significant credit or gain substantial territory. Using both bombs quickly might force Japan to surrender to America alone, limiting Moscow's influence in post-war Asia. The fact that Nagasaki was bombed on August 9th, the day after the USSR joined the fight, may not be coincidental. Fifth, inside Japan, the impact of Hiroshima alone did not break the government's deadlock. As both Butao and Maddox document, Japan's Supreme War Council remained divided even after Hiroshima. Some military leaders argued that Hiroshima might be a one-time event and that Japan should wait to see if America could repeat it. By dropping a second bomb just 3 days later, the United States proved that atomic attacks could and would continue. The combination of 2 atomic bombs and the Soviet entry finally created enough pressure to enable the emperor's unprecedented intervention. Hasegawa argues in Racing the Enemy that neither the bombs nor Soviet entry alone would have been sufficient to force surrender. The atomic bombs showed that Japanese cities could be destroyed one by one. Soviet entry eliminated the last hope of negotiated peace through Moscow. Together, they made clear that Japan had no options left except unconditional surrender or complete national destruction. Some historians take a more critical view, arguing that Japan was already much closer to surrender than American leaders believed. They contend that modifying the surrender terms to clearly guarantee the emperor's position might have ended the war without atomic bombs, and that using 2 bombs in 3 days was unnecessary. They point out that Japan ultimately did keep its emperor, suggesting the Allies could have offered this guarantee earlier. The debate remains unresolved. What seems clear is that American leaders in August 1945 did not believe Japan was about to surrender. Intelligence showed Japanese forces massing to resist invasion. Peace feelers through Moscow had not produced results. The military was following standing orders to use atomic weapons as they became available. The atomic bombs were seen as tools to end a terrible war as quickly as possible, even if that meant using more than one. Whether other paths might have worked remains one of history's unanswerable questions. History cannot be rerun with different choices. The bombs were dropped, Japan surrendered, and the war ended. The world then entered the nuclear age, living ever since in the shadow of weapons that could level entire cities in a single flash of light. Every nation that has considered building nuclear weapons since 1945 has done so with knowledge of what happened to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The decision to use atomic weapons against Japan emerged from a convergence of many forces, a war of terrible brutality that had conditioned both sides to expect continued killing until one side was completely destroyed. A new American president relying on advisors and policies inherited from his predecessor, a Japanese government split between those who sought peace and those who demanded a final battle to the death, and weapons whose power no one fully understood until they were used. What happened in August 1945 was shaped by institutions, assumptions, and pressures on multiple sides of the Pacific. No single leader controlled the outcome, as decisions made years earlier had created momentum that proved difficult to stop. The weapons existed, the orders had been written, the targets had been chosen, and Japan had not surrendered. The story reveals how decisions with permanent consequences can emerge from systems where no single person holds complete control over events. It shows how fear, confusion, miscalculation, and the fog of war can push events in directions that later seemed tragic but at the time appeared necessary to those making the choices. 80 years later, historians continue to examine these events with fresh eyes and newly released documents. Archives in Japan, the United States, and Russia have provided materials that were classified for decades. Old assumptions are questioned in light of new evidence. Simple narratives give way to more complex understanding as scholars piece together what different leaders knew and believed at each moment. But some questions may never be fully answered because history does not always provide clear verdicts on the choices nations make in war. What remains is the shadow of August 1945, the knowledge that humans created weapons capable of destroying entire cities in an instant, and that once those devices existed, they were used. The world has lived with that knowledge ever since, and the questions raised in those terrible days continue to echo across the generations. Nations have spent decades trying to prevent nuclear arms from being used again. The bombs that fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki remain the only atomic weapons ever used in warfare, but the threat they represent has shaped international relations ever since. The decision to drop 2 atomic bombs emerged from this convergence of institutional momentum, governmental paralysis, and a Japanese leadership that could not agree on peace until it was too late. But this was only one chapter in a much larger story. To understand how Japan and America came to this terrible crossroads, watch our documentary on why Japan had to attack Pearl Harbor in the first place.